I forbid this. This is traumatizing these children. You have no right.
Get out of my way, or I'll add obstruction to your list. Turn. Around.
The sun was a warm, benevolent hand on the back of Northwood Elementary. It was 10:15 on a Tuesday morning in May, the kind of day that felt manufactured for childhood memories. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint, chalky dust from the hopscotch grids drawn on the asphalt. Sarah Jenkins stood near the oak tree at the edge of the playground. Her worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are tucked under one arm. At 43, she possessed the calm, observant energy of a teacher who had spent 2 decades navigating the beautiful chaos of third graders. Her eyes, a clear and steady blue, scanned the yard with unpracticed efficiency, tracking a game of tag here, a huddle of secret sharers there. It was a symphony of controlled mayhem, and she was its conductor, Principal Miller, a kind man whose gentle demeanor belied a fierce dedication to his students and staff, was making his usual rounds. He gave Sarah a nod and a warm smile as he passed. Another perfect day in paradise. Sarah, he said, his voice carrying easily over the cheerful shrieks of the children. They're burning off that morning energy. Robert, she replied with a laugh. My afternoon math lesson will thank them for it. The rhythm of the playground was a familiar comfort. The metallic clink of the swing set chains, the rhythmic thud of a kickball against the brick wall, the rise and fall of dozens of young voices. It was the soundtrack of her life's work. She had taught the older siblings of many of these children. She had attended their high school graduations and received tearful hugs from parents who credited her with being the first person to truly see their child's potential. Northwood wasn't just her job. It was her community, her anchor. She had never worked anywhere else. She had never wanted to. The interruption began not with a bang, but with a low rumble that slowly separated itself from the distant hum of traffic on the main road. A vehicle was approaching down the long, tree-lined driveway that led to the school's main entrance, but it was moving faster than the usual parent minivan. Sarah's gaze instinctively shifted, a familiar shape, but in an unfamiliar context. A black and white county sheriff's patrol car. It didn't slow as it approached the staff parking lot. Instead, it continued past, its tires crunching on the gravel service path that led directly to the edge of the playground. A flicker of unease, sharp and unwelcome, went through her. Police rarely came to Northwood, and when they did, it was for community outreach events or, in one memorable instance, to help a family of ducks cross the busy street. This felt different. There was an urgency in the car's movement that set her teeth on edge. The car came to an abrupt stop just yards from the swing set, its engine cutting out with a final, definitive grunt. The sudden silence that followed was more jarring than the noise had been. The children, their internal radars for adult anxiety finely tuned, began to slow their games. The symphony faltered. A few kids pointed. The kickball rolled to a stop. The driver's side door opened, and a deputy stepped out. He was young, probably not yet 30, with a military-style haircut and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. His movements were clipped and overly confident. He adjusted his duty belt, his hand lingering for a moment on the butt of his holstered firearm. The passenger door opened, and a second deputy emerged. This one was older, heavier set, with a weary expression that suggested he'd seen this all before, and was already tired of how it was going to end. Sarah felt a protective instinct flare. Whatever this was, it had no place here, not in front of the children. She took a step forward, placing herself subtly between the officers and the now silent crowd of students. She saw Principal Miller change direction, his face a mask of professional concern, and begin walking briskly toward the deputies. She held up a hand in a calming gesture to a few of her students who looked particularly frightened. "It's okay," she mouthed, forcing a reassuring smile that felt brittle and fake. The younger deputy, his eyes hidden behind reflective sunglasses, scanned the yard. His gaze swept past the children, past the other teachers, and then locked onto her. There was no flicker of doubt, no hesitation. He pointed a single, definitive finger directly at Sarah Jenkins. "That's her," he said, his voice sharp and loud enough to cut through the quiet apprehension that had blanketed the playground. "The one in the blue sweater? That's our woman." His partner sighed. A barely audible puff of air, but didn't contradict him. The young deputy started walking, his boots grinding on the gravel path with a sound that, to Sarah, felt like the scraping of a key in a lock, trapping her in a nightmare that was just beginning. The world seemed to shrink, focusing down to the ever-closing distance between herself and the approaching deputy. His partner hung back near the patrol car, a silent, passive observer. The younger officer walked with a purpose that was both unnerving and deeply out of place. This wasn't the measured approach of an officer assessing a scene. It was the targeted advance of a predator who had already singled out its prey. Principal Miller intercepted him halfway. "Excuse me, deputy," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm Robert Miller, the principal here. Can I help you? This is a closed campus during school hours." He positioned himself squarely in the deputy's path, a mild-mannered man creating a physical and procedural barrier. The deputy, whose name tag read M. Thorne, didn't break stride. He sidestepped Miller as if he were a piece of furniture. "I have official business here, sir. Step aside. My responsibility is the safety of these children and my staff." Miller persisted, his voice rising slightly. "You can't just walk onto a playground like this. What is the nature of your business? Who are you looking for?" Thorne stopped for a brief moment, turning his head just enough to glare at the principal over his shoulder. "I'm looking for her," he repeated, gesturing again toward Sarah, "and I'm not asking for permission." He then completely dismissed the head of the school and resumed his advance. The message was clear. Civilian authority meant nothing here. His badge was the only authority that mattered. Sarah's mind raced, a frantic search for a logical explanation. A warrant for a traffic ticket she'd forgotten? A family emergency? Had something happened to her sister? But none of those scenarios fit the aggressive, public nature of this confrontation. This felt accusatory. This felt personal. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, unnatural quiet of the schoolyard. The children were statues, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Other teachers were starting to move in from the periphery, their expressions mirroring her own confusion. Thorne stopped a few feet in front of her. He was close enough now that she could see her own distorted reflection in his sunglasses. He had a small, jagged scar just above his right eyebrow. "Are you Sarah Jenkins?" he demanded. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice remarkably steady. She clasped her hands in front of her to keep them from shaking. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We have a warrant for your arrest," Thorne stated flatly. The words hung in the air, nonsensical and absurd. Warrant? Arrest? It was as if he were speaking a foreign language. "A warrant for what?" she asked, a sliver of disbelief cutting through the shock. "There must be some mistake. I'm a teacher. I'm in the middle of my workday." "The warrant is for felony fraud and identity theft," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension, as if explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. "Now, are you going to come peacefully, or do we have to do this the hard way?" Principal Miller had caught up. his face now flushed with anger. "Deputy, this is completely inappropriate. You are frightening my students. Whatever this is, we can handle it in my office. Let's go inside and discuss this rationally." "There's nothing to discuss," Thorne snapped, his attention never leaving Sarah. "She's under arrest. The discussion is over." "I think you're making a terrible mistake," Sarah said, her voice pleading now. She looked past Thorne, trying to make eye contact with his older partner, hoping for a sign of reason. But the other deputy just stared at the ground. "Could you please tell me what this is about? Could you check your information? My name is Sarah Jenkins. I teach 3rd grade at this school." She was restating the obvious, her reality, hoping it would somehow penetrate his wall of certainty. "I know who you are," Thorne said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've been a very busy woman, Sarah." He took another step forward, entering her personal space. The scent of cheap air freshener from his car clung to his uniform. A fellow teacher, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, who had been at Northwood almost as long as Sarah, stepped forward. "Officer, we can vouch for her. She's been here all morning. She's one of the most respected people in this community. There has to be a misunderstanding." Thorne shot Maria a look of pure venom. "Ma'am, you interfere with a lawful arrest, and you'll be joining her in the back of my car. Is that clear?" Maria recoiled as if struck. He turned back to Sarah. The pretense of civility, thin as it was now gone. His hand moved from his belt and unclipped his handcuffs. The metallic click was obscenely loud in the quiet yard. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a point of no return. The children, who had been watching in silent horror, now began to murmur. A few of the younger ones started to cry. This was no longer a confusing adult event. It was a direct threat to a figure of safety and authority in their lives. Their teacher, Miss Jenkins, was in trouble, and the monster wasn't under the bed. He was wearing a badge and standing right in front of them. The beautiful Tuesday morning had curdled into something ugly and terrifying. "You can't be serious," Sarah whispered, the words barely audible. Her gaze was fixed on the handcuffs dangling from Deputy Thorne's hand. They looked impossibly solid, brutally real against the backdrop of colorful playground equipment. "You're going to arrest me? Here? In front of my students?" "I'll arrest you wherever I find you," Thorne said, his voice cold. "Public place, private place, makes no difference to me. Now, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Principal Miller moved again, putting himself between them. "I forbid this," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and helplessness. "This is traumatizing these children. You have no right. We will call the superintendent. We will call the sheriff himself." Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "You do that. The sheriff is the one who signs my paycheck. Now get out of my way, or I'll add obstruction to your list of problems today." He placed a hand on Miller's chest and shoved him, not hard enough to knock him down, but with enough force to send him stumbling back a few steps. It was a calculated act of dominance, a physical demonstration that he was in complete control. A collective gasp went through the small crowd of teachers. A few children began to sob openly. This was a violation of every rule, seen and unseen, that governed their safe little world. You didn't push the principal, you didn't yell at teachers, and you certainly didn't put them in handcuffs. "Please don't," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. Her concern was no longer for herself, but for the terrified children watching this unfold. "Just let me go to the office. We can call someone. We can clear this up. Don't do this to them." "Your concern for them is a little late, don't you think?" Thorne sneered. "Should have thought of that before you started breaking the law." He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was painfully tight, his fingers digging into her bicep. Sarah flinched but didn't pull away. Resisting was pointless. She knew that much. It would only make things worse, escalate the violence of the scene. She cast one last, desperate look at Robert Miller, who stood frozen, his face a portrait of impotent fury. She looked at Maria, who had her arms around two crying students. She looked at the sea of small, upturned faces, their eyes wide with a fear they would likely carry with them for years. "Turn, around," Thorne commanded, yanking her arm with a feeling of profound resignation, a sense of falling into a dark, bottomless pit. Sarah complied. She turned her back to him, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The morning sun felt hot on her neck. She could hear the frantic whispers of the children, the hushed, angry tones of the other teachers trying to herd them away, to shield them from the rest of this, but it was too late. The image was already seared into their minds. The first handcuff closed around her right wrist. The cold steel was a shock against her skin, an alien feeling of absolute restraint. It bit into the soft flesh, unforgiving and final. Thorne pulled her other arm back, roughly twisting her shoulder, and secured the second cuff. The metallic click, click, click as he tightened it echoed the hammering of her heart. Just like that. She was a prisoner, a third-grade teacher, arrested for a crime she couldn't even comprehend, shackled on the playground where she had taught hundreds of children how to read, how to be kind, how to navigate the world. Thorne kept a firm grip on her arm, his fingers pressed against the chain of the cuffs. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, rattling off the Miranda rights in a bored, monotonous drone. The words were meaningless static to Sarah. Her mind was a whirlwind of shame, confusion, and a terrifying sense of unreality. This couldn't be happening. It felt like a scene from a movie, something happening to someone else. But the pain in her wrists and the weight of the steel were undeniable. His partner finally stirred from his position by the car. He walked over slowly, his expression unreadable but tinged with something that might have been discomfort. "Thorne, maybe we should just put her in the car," he said quietly, his eyes flicking toward the huddle of crying children. "I'm getting to that. Peterson," Thorne shot back, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Just doing my job, by the book." But there was nothing by the book about this. It was a grotesque abuse of power, a spectacle designed to humiliate and intimidate. The warrant, whatever its origin, was just an excuse. The real crime being committed on that playground was the violent tearing of a community's fabric, and Deputy Thorne was holding the shears. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the sight of her students' faces. But their terrified expressions were already burned into her memory, a permanent scar on what had once been a beautiful Tuesday morning. "All right, let's go," Thorne said, tugging her arm to propel her forward. Each step was a fresh wave of humiliation. The cuffs forced her into an unnatural posture, her shoulders pulled back, her balance slightly off. She felt fragile, exposed. The walk from the oak tree to the patrol car, a distance she could normally cover in 20 seconds, stretched into an eternity. The playground had become a gallery of witnesses. The other teachers, acting on instinct, were trying to create a buffer, moving the children back toward the school building, their voices low and urgent. "Inside. Everyone. Let's go inside. Recess is over." But children are drawn to calamity. Many of them resisted, craning their necks, their eyes locked on their teacher being led away like a dangerous animal. Worse than the children's eyes were the cell phones. Sarah became acutely aware of them. Maria Rodriguez, despite her fear, had her phone out, her hand trembling as she recorded. Another teacher, Mr. Gable, the young gym coach, was filming from the other side of the yard. Even Principal Miller, after his initial shock, had pulled out his phone. They weren't being ghoulish. They were documenting. They were creating evidence. They knew, on a gut level, that what they were seeing was profoundly wrong, and it needed to be captured. Sarah kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the uneven gravel beneath her feet. She focused on the simple act of walking, of putting one foot in front of the other, trying to maintain a shred of dignity. But it was impossible. With every step, she could feel the stares. She could hear the hushed, horrified whispers. She could feel the vibrations of a world that had been violently knocked off its axis. "Walk faster," Thorne muttered, giving her a slight push from behind. She stumbled but caught her balance. The push wasn't necessary. It was just another small assertion of his absolute power over her. He was the captor. She was the captive. He made the rules. As they neared the patrol car, Deputy Peterson opened the rear door. The inside of the car was black plastic and metal mesh, a cage. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant wafted out. It was the most unwelcoming space she had ever seen. "Watch your head," Peterson said, his voice a low monotone. It was a rote phrase, devoid of any real concern, but compared to Thorne's overt hostility, it felt like a minor kindness. Thorne pushed her forward, forcing her to bend at the waist to get into the car. The movement was awkward and painful with her hands cuffed behind her back. She bumped her head on the doorframe, a sharp, jarring impact. A small cry of pain escaped her lips. "I told you to watch your head," Thorne said with a smug satisfaction. He shoved her the rest of the way onto the hard plastic bench of the back seat and slammed the door. The sound was a deafening thud of finality. She was in the cage. Through the metal grill, she watched as Thorne and Peterson conferred for a moment. Principal Miller approached them again, his phone still in his hand, his voice a low, angry buzz she couldn't make out. Thorne just shook his head, laughed, and waved a dismissive hand. He clearly considered the principal a nuisance, an irrelevance. Inside the car, the world was muffled and distorted. The sun beat down on the roof, and the interior was already starting to feel like an oven. She could see her school, her playground, her colleagues, her students, all through the bars of a window, as if she were looking at a life that was no longer hers. She saw Maria gather the last of the crying children, herding them toward the safety of the classroom. She saw Robert Miller standing his ground, arguing, pleading, refusing to back down even though the battle was already lost. Thorne finally turned away from the principal and walked to the driver's side. He got in, the car rocking with his weight, and started the engine. The air conditioning kicked on with a weak puff of warm air. He didn't look at her. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching his own reflection, and then put the car in drive. As the patrol car began to pull away, Sarah pressed her face against the cool glass of the side window for one last look. She saw her copy of Where the Wild Things Are Lying Forgotten on the ground near the oak tree. Its colorful cover a stark contrast to the drab reality of the moment. A single, silent tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The long, tree-lined driveway that had always been a symbol of welcome now felt like an escape route, carrying her away from everything she had ever known, toward a future that was terrifyingly, brutally uncertain. The walk was over, but the shame was just beginning to set in, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. The patrol car turned onto the main road, leaving the familiar sanctuary of Northwood Elementary behind. The transition was jarring. One moment, Sarah was surrounded by the sounds and sights of her life's work. The next, she was a silent passenger in a mobile cage, watching the mundane world of errands and commutes pass by outside her window. People in other cars glanced over, their expressions shifting from idle curiosity to a more focused, judgmental stare as they registered the sheriff's vehicle and the silhouetted figure in the back. Each glance felt like a tiny, sharp jab. The silence inside the car was thick and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the police radio and the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Deputy Thorne drove with one hand on the wheel, the picture of casual authority. Deputy Peterson sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, occasionally jotting something down on a clipboard. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't speak to her. She was cargo, not a person. After several minutes of this tense silence, Sarah decided she couldn't just sit there. She had to try to reason with them, to appeal to some sense of logic that Thorne's aggressive pride had so far obscured. "Officers," she began, her voice hoarse. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Officers, I need you to listen to me. There has been a profound mistake." Thorne's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting hers for a second. There was no curiosity, only annoyance. "Save it for the judge," he said, his voice flat. "You already had your chance to cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" she asked, her frustration rising. "You never asked me a single question. You just started making accusations. You have the wrong person. The wrong person. Doesn't that concern you at all?" "What concerns me," Thorne said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "is a suspect who starts yelling about a mistake the second the cuffs go on. It's a classic move. We see it every day." "But I can prove it," she insisted, leaning forward as much as the cuffs would allow. "My driver's license is in my purse in my classroom. It has my photo, my date of birth. My school ID is there. My employee records are in the principal's office. You didn't even try to verify anything. You just arrested me. The warrant had your name on it. Sarah Jenkins. That's you, isn't it?" "Yes, but there must be another Sarah Jenkins. Or the information in your warrant is wrong. My date of birth is August 12th, 1980. "What does the warrant say?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Thorne, a silent question in his eyes. It was the first sign that her words might be penetrating the wall of their certainty. Thorne, however, doubled down. "We don't debate the details of a warrant with the person we're arresting. That's not how this works. You can tell your story to the booking sergeant." "So you'd rather arrest the wrong person and ruin their life than take 2 minutes to confirm a date of birth?" Her voice was sharp with indignation. "Is that what doing your job means?" Thorne's jaw tightened. He gripped the steering wheel harder. "You've got a real mouth on you, you know that? A real attitude problem. Maybe that's how you got into this mess in the first place." The accusation was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that it momentarily stunned her into silence. He wasn't just mistaken, he was actively twisting her attempts to prove her innocence into evidence of her guilt. Her calm, logical appeals were being reframed as having a mouth and an attitude. It was a no-win situation. If she was silent, she was compliant and therefore guilty. If she spoke up, she was difficult and therefore guilty. She leaned back against the hard plastic seat, a cold dread washing over her. This wasn't about a mistake anymore. It was about one man's ego. Deputy Thorne had made a public spectacle of her arrest in front of an entire school. He had shoved her principal. He had ignored procedure. To admit now that it was all for nothing, that he had arrested the wrong person, would be a massive professional and personal humiliation. He couldn't afford to be wrong. Therefore, in his mind, she had to be the right person. His reality was bending to fit his narrative. She looked out the window again, watching the familiar landmarks of her town, the grocery store, the library, the park, slide by. They looked alien, like parts of a life she could no longer access. She had lived in this town her whole life, built a reputation of trust and integrity over decades. and in the span of 15 minutes, one man with a badge and an oversized ego had stripped it all away. The rest of the ride passed in that same heavy silence. Sarah didn't try to speak again. There was no point. She was no longer fighting a mistake. She was fighting a man who was determined not to have made one. And that was a far more dangerous battle. The county jail was a soulless, beige building that smelled of industrial cleaner and quiet desperation. Thorne parked the patrol car in a secure sally port, the heavy garage door rolling down behind them with a definitive clang. The sound echoed the closing of the cell door in her mind. The brief journey from the car to the booking area was another blur of indignity. Thorne held her arm in the same tight grip, leading her through a series of locked doors operated by unseen buzzers. The booking area was a large, brightly lit room with linoleum floors and a long counter. Behind the counter sat a heavy-set older sergeant with a graying mustache and tired eyes. His name tag read SGT Davis. He looked up from his paperwork as they approached. His expression neutral, professional. "What do you have for me, Thorne?" Davis asked, his voice a low rumble. "One female under arrest on a felony warrant. Sarah Jenkins," Thorne announced with a hint of pride, as if presenting a trophy. He pushed Sarah forward toward the counter. Davis took the file Thorne handed him and began to type the name into his computer. He squinted at the screen, then back at the file. He typed again. "Jenkins, warrant out of state for fraud, identity theft. That it?" "That's the one," Thorne confirmed. "All right, ma'am," Davis said, his eyes finally landing on Sarah. "I need your full name and date of birth for confirmation." "Sarah Elizabeth Jenkins," she said, her voice clear and steady. "August 12th, 1980. Davis's fingers paused over the keyboard. He stopped typing. He looked from his screen to the warrant paperwork in front of him, then back to the screen. A deep frown creased his forehead. He slowly turned his chair to face Thorne, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking smug. "Thorne," Sergeant Davis said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What's the date of birth on your suspect?" Thorne blinked. "It's in the file." "I'm not asking the file, I'm asking you." Davis pressed, his tired eyes now hard and focused. "What's the date of birth for the Sarah Jenkins you were supposed to arrest?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Thorne's face. He unfolded his arms and stepped toward the counter, looking at the paperwork as if for the first time. It says here, October 2nd, 1989. A heavy silence descended on the room. Davis leaned back in his chair and stared at Thorne, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound irritation. Deputy Peterson, who had been silent the whole time, suddenly found a deep interest in the scuff marks on his boots. "This woman," Davis said, gesturing with his pen toward Sarah, "told you her date of birth is August 12th, 1980. The wanted felon is nearly a decade younger. This woman is 43 years old. Your suspect is 34. Did you happen to notice that? Or did you bother to ask for an ID before you cuffed her in front of a school full of children?" Thorne's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. The smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a panicked, defensive anger. "She was uncooperative," he stammered. "She refused to identify herself. The situation was tense." "I did not," Sarah interjected, her voice ringing with indignation. "I begged you to check your information. I told you where my ID was. You refused to listen." "Quiet!" Thorne barked at her, then turned back to Davis. "She was obstructing, resisting from the moment I got there." Davis rubbed his temples, a long, weary sigh escaping his lips. He had seen this before. A young, hot-headed officer makes a bad arrest, and instead of admitting the mistake, they invent new charges to cover their tracks. It was a cowardly and dangerous game. "So let me get this straight," Davis said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You arrested the wrong person on a felony warrant, and now you're telling me you want to charge this woman, a school teacher with no record whom you've already wrongfully arrested and publicly humiliated, with obstruction and resisting arrest." "That's right," Thorne said, his jaw set stubbornly. He was committed to the lie. To back down now would be to admit the entire series of events was his fault. His ego wouldn't allow it. "She made my job impossible. She refused lawful orders." Davis stared at him for a long, hard moment. He looked at Sarah, at the red marks on her wrists where the cuffs had been, at the tear track on her cheek, at the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her despite the circumstances. Then he looked back at the red-faced, defensive deputy in front of him. He shook his head slowly. "You're a real piece of work, Thorne," Davis muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned back to his computer. With a few keystrokes, he invalidated the arrest on the felony warrant. Then, with visible reluctance, he began to fill out a new report. Fine. Process her for obstruction of governmental administration and resisting arrest without violence. Misdemeanors. He looked up at Sarah, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this. We're going to get you processed and out of here as quickly as we can. You'll likely be released on your own recognizance." The relief Sarah expected to feel didn't come. The felony charge was gone, but it had been replaced by a lie designed to protect a man who had abused his power and refused to be held accountable. She wasn't just a victim of a mistake anymore. She was the victim of a cover-up. And that felt infinitely worse. Thorne had not only arrested the wrong person, he had intentionally and maliciously fabricated charges to justify his error. The mistake had now become a deliberate act of injustice. The next 3 hours were a study in bureaucratic dehumanization. Sarah was photographed, her fingerprints digitally scanned. A female officer conducted a pat-down search that was professional but still felt deeply invasive. They took her shoes and her simple silver necklace, cataloging her meager possessions in a manila envelope. The entire process was carried out with a detached, procedural air that made it clear she was no longer Sarah Jenkins, third-grade teacher. She was a case number, a set of fingerprints, a body to be moved through the system. She was placed in a small, concrete holding cell with a metal bench and a stainless steel toilet. The heavy door slammed shut with a sound of utter finality, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the arrest and the ride to the jail was beginning to fade, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a trembling that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. She sat on the cold bench and tried to make sense of the cascading series of events. It was a mistake. A simple, colossal, life-altering mistake. But it had been compounded by pride. Deputy Thorne's refusal to admit fault had transformed a blunder into a malicious act. He had chosen to sacrifice her reputation to protect his ego. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What about her students? What were they thinking? What had Principal Miller told the parents? The thought of the phone calls he must be making, explaining why their children's teacher had been arrested on the playground, filled her with a fresh wave of nausea. Her career, her community standing, her very identity, all of it felt fragile, breakable. An arrest record, even for fabricated misdemeanor charges, could be a death sentence for a teacher. The school board had a zero-tolerance policy. She could be suspended, even fired, before she ever had a chance to prove her innocence. After what felt like a lifetime, the cell door opened. It was Sergeant Davis. "All right, Jenkins, you're being released on your own recognizance. We've got your property at the front desk. Sign here." He handed her a clipboard with a form. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. The signature was a spidery, unrecognizable version of her own. She followed him out of the holding area, back into the brightly lit booking room. Deputy Thorne was gone. The female officer handed her the manila envelope containing her necklace. "Your shoes are by the door. Ma'am, you're free to go." Free to go? The words sounded hollow. She walked out of the county jail and into the late afternoon sun. The brightness was blinding after the dim light of the cell. The world outside was still moving. Cars driving, people walking, life going on as if nothing had happened. But for Sarah, everything had changed. She felt tainted, branded. She fumbled in her purse, which the school had thankfully sent over, and found her phone. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications, missed calls and frantic text messages from colleagues, friends, and her sister. Her thumb hovered over the screen, unsure of who to call first. She needed more than a friend. She needed more than family. She needed a weapon. She scrolled through her contacts and found the number she was looking for. It had been given to her years ago by a union representative during a routine contract negotiation meeting. "You hope you never need this," the rep had said. "But if you ever find yourself in a situation where your rights are being violated, this is the man you call." Her finger pressed the screen. The phone rang twice before a calm, confident voice answered. "Julian Croft." "Mr. Croft," Sarah began, her voice cracking with emotion. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm a teacher at Northwood Elementary. I think I need your help. I've just been arrested." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Tell me everything, Ms. Jenkins. Start from the beginning, and don't leave out a single detail." As Sarah began to speak, recounting the entire nightmare from the moment the patrol car appeared on the playground, she felt a tiny, flickering ember of hope. The call was a lifeline. She was no longer just a victim. She was taking the first step toward fighting back. The humiliation was still fresh. The fear was still palpable. But beneath it all, a new feeling was taking root. A steely, unyielding resolve. They had picked the wrong woman to bully. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness. And they were about to find out just how wrong they were. By the time Sarah arrived home, dropped off by her sister who had rushed to the jail in a panic, the story was already beginning to break. The first wave was local, a small article on the town's news website. Citing a police incident at Northwood Elementary, the school district had released a vague, carefully worded statement about an unforeseen event involving a staff member and assuring parents that all students were safe. But in the age of social media, official statements were no match for the raw power of a viral video. It was Maria Rodriguez's video that hit first. Shaky, emotionally charged, and filmed from a gut-wrenching perspective just yards away. It captured the entire confrontation. It showed Principal Miller's reasonable attempts to de-escalate. It showed Deputy Thorne's arrogant dismissal of school authority. It showed the terror on the children's faces. And most damningly, it showed the moment a beloved teacher, in her familiar blue sweater, was wrenched around and placed in handcuffs. Maria had uploaded it to her private social media page, intending only to share it with other teachers and concerned parents. But from there, it spread like wildfire. Within an hour, it had been shared hundreds of times. By evening, thousands. Local news affiliates ripped the video from the web and ran it on the 5 o'clock news. By nightfall, it had been picked up by national news outlets. The hashtag Justice for Miss Jenkins started trending. The video was a perfect storm of outrage. It tapped into a deep well of public anxiety about police overreach, but it personalized it in a universally understood context: the safety of a school. This wasn't a murky, late-night encounter on a deserted street. This happened in broad daylight, on a playground, to a woman who represented nurture, education, and safety. If she wasn't safe from this kind of arbitrary, aggressive display of power, who was? Sarah watched it happen from the cocoon of her living room sofa, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in her hands. Her phone was a constant buzz of incoming alerts. She saw her own face, confused and frightened, staring back at her from the screen. She read the comments, a tidal wave of support and fury from thousands of strangers across the country. This is what a police state looks like. That officer needs to be fired and charged. I'm a teacher. This is my worst nightmare. She was just protecting her kids. The principal is a hero for trying to stop him. The cop who shoved him should be arrested for assault. The story evolved at a dizzying pace. Soon, the gym coach's video surfaced, offering a different angle. Then a third, grainier video appeared, filmed by a parent who had been waiting in the car line. Each new piece of footage confirmed the narrative. Sarah had been calm. The principal had been professional, and Deputy Thorne had been the sole aggressor. The sheriff's department, clearly caught off guard by the scale of the backlash, made a critical error. Instead of showing contrition or promising a thorough investigation, they released a defensive statement late that night. It stated that Deputy Thorne was acting on a valid felony warrant, and that Sarah Jenkins was arrested after becoming uncooperative and obstructing the officer's investigation. The statement was gasoline on a raging fire. It directly contradicted the visual evidence that millions of people were now watching on a loop. The public wasn't just angry anymore, they were incandescent. How could she be uncooperative when the videos showed her standing still? How could she obstruct when the videos showed the principal being shoved for simply asking questions? The department's attempt to control the narrative had backfired spectacularly, painting them as not only incompetent, but dishonest. They were defending the indefensible. Julian Croft called her just before 10 o'clock. "Sarah, are you watching this?" His voice was calm, but she could hear an undercurrent of energy, the excitement of a legal strategist seeing the battlefield take shape. "I can't look away," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "It feels like it's happening to someone else." "That's good," he said. "I want you to try to maintain that distance. You are the client. You are the victim. Let me be the warrior. The department's statement tonight was a gift. They've locked themselves into a demonstrably false narrative. They've foolishly chosen to die on Thorn's Hill. This is no longer just about a bad arrest. Sarah, this is about a systemic failure and a subsequent cover-up. We have them." Lying in bed that night, the house finally quiet. Sarah couldn't sleep. The events of the day played over and over in her mind. The confrontation, the cuffs, the cell. But now, those images were interspersed with the tide of support she had seen online. She was no longer just a humiliated woman. She had become a symbol. Her personal nightmare had tapped into a national nerve, transforming her quiet, ordinary life into the epicenter of a raging debate about justice, power, and accountability. The tsunami had been unleashed, and it was either going to drown her or carry her toward a shore she couldn't yet imagine. 2 days later, Sarah sat in the polished conference room of Julian Croft's law office. The space was the antithesis of the county jail. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. The furniture was modern and comfortable, and the air smelled of old books and fresh coffee. It was a place of power, but a different kind of power, one built on intellect, strategy, and the meticulous application of the law. Julian Croft was in his early 50s, with a shock of graying hair and an intensity in his eyes that was both comforting and formidable. He wasn't a flashy courtroom brawler. He was known as a legal chess master, someone who won his cases long before they ever saw a jury, through painstaking research and relentless discovery. First, he began, sliding a bottle of water across the large oak table to her. I want to acknowledge the trauma you've experienced. What happened was not just illegal. It was a profound violation of your dignity and your standing in the community. Our goal is not just to correct that, but to ensure the system that allowed it to happen is held accountable so that it never happens again. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The misdemeanor charges of obstruction and resisting are a legal fiction. They are the desperate act of a department trying to justify the unjustifiable. They will be dropped. I've already spoken with the district attorney's office. They've seen the videos. They want no part of this fiasco. So, we can put that worry aside. A wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy washed over Sarah. They're being dropped? Without question, Croft confirmed. That's the easy part. That's defense. What I want to talk about today is offense. We are going to file a federal civil rights lawsuit against Deputy Mark Thorne individually and against the county for its failure to properly train and supervise its officers. We will be suing under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and excessive force. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. But I need you to understand what this means. This is not a quick payday. This is a war. They will dig into your life. They will try to find anything. A disgruntled ex-student, a past disagreement with a neighbor, a speeding ticket from 10 years ago, to paint you as someone who deserved this. They will try to exhaust you, to bury us in paperwork, to make you feel like it's not worth the fight. I understand, Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. She had spent the last 2 days oscillating between fear and fury. The fury was winning. What happened wasn't just about me. He terrified those children. He assaulted my principal. He treated my school like his personal fiefdom. If I don't do this, what's to stop him from doing it to someone else? A slow smile spread across Croft's face. That's the answer I was hoping for. This isn't about the money. Sarah, the money is just the tool the law uses to measure the harm and punish the offender. This is about change. We are going to demand records, Thorne's personnel file, his training history, every citizen complaint ever filed against him. We are going to depose him, his partner, the booking sergeant, and the sheriff himself. We are going to put their entire operation under a microscope. For the next 2 hours, they went over the strategy. Croft explained the legal process in clear, concise terms, demystifying the intimidating jargon. He talked about discovery, depositions, and summary judgments. He was methodical, precise, and utterly confident. He wasn't just her lawyer, he was her teacher, educating her on the mechanics of the battle ahead. Our narrative is simple and powerful because it's the truth, Croft explained as he sketched a flowchart on a whiteboard. A decorated, beloved teacher was performing her duties, safeguarding children. A poorly trained, arrogant officer, acting on flawed information, chose escalation over de-escalation at every turn. When his initial mistake was revealed, he and his department conspired to create false charges to cover it up. It's a straight line from incompetence to malice. He circled the word malice with a red marker. That's the key. We're not just arguing that Thorne made a mistake. We're arguing that his decision to proceed with the obstruction charge after he knew you were the wrong person was a malicious act, intended to punish you for his own error. That's what opens the door to significant punitive damages. As Sarah listened, She felt the last vestiges of her fear being forged into something harder, something more resilient. She had walked into this office as a victim. She was walking out as a plaintiff. The distinction was critical. A victim is someone things happen to. A plaintiff is someone who makes things happen. Julian Croft hadn't just given her legal representation. He had given her back her agency. He was handing her a sword forged from the law, and she was ready to learn how to wield it. The fight for justice for Miss Jenkins had officially begun. The deposition of Deputy Mark Thorne took place 6 months later in a sterile, windowless room at a neutral law firm. The air was thick with tension. Sarah sat beside Julian Croft, her hands clasped calmly in her lap. Across the long table sat Thorne, looking uncomfortable in a suit and tie, flanked by 2 attorneys from the county counsel's office. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word. For the first hour, Croft was disarmingly gentle. He asked Thorne about his background, his training at the academy, his time with the department. He established a baseline of Thorne's understanding, or lack thereof, of departmental procedures regarding warrants and on-site identification. Thorne's answers were clipped, confident, and full of jargon. He was playing the part of the consummate professional. Then, Croft slowly pivoted to the day of the arrest. Deputy Thorne, let's talk about your arrival at Northwood Elementary. Your dash cam shows you driving onto the campus at approximately 25 miles per hour. The posted speed limit is 10. Why were you speeding? Thorne shifted in his chair. I was focused on locating the suspect, sir. It was a dynamic situation. A dynamic situation? On a playground full of 8-year-olds? Croft asked, his voice still mild. When you exited your vehicle, what was your primary objective? To locate and secure the subject of a felony warrant. Was your objective to confirm the identity of the subject? That is part of the process, yes. And what is the department's standard procedure for confirming identity before making an arrest? Croft pressed. We use the information in the warrant and visual identification if possible. And if the person disputes their identity? What is the procedure then? We assess their claims, Thorne said, hesitation creeping into his voice. Croft leaned forward, his friendly demeanor evaporating. But you didn't assess Ms. Jenkins's claims, did you? She told you there must be a mistake. Principal Miller told you there must be a mistake, but you never once asked to see her identification, did you? The situation did not allow for it, Thorne insisted. She was being uncooperative. Uncooperative? Croft's voice was sharp now. Let's be very specific. Deputy, I'm going to play a portion of the body camera footage from your partner, Deputy Peterson. He nodded to an assistant, who cued the video on a large monitor. The room was filled with the sounds of that day. The children's frightened voices. Principal Miller's calm but firm protests. They watched the scene unfold in damning clarity. They saw Sarah standing still, her hands in plain sight. They saw her speaking in a calm voice. Croft paused the video. Deputy Thorne, at what point in that clip did Miss Jenkins resist you? Did she run? Did she raise her hands to you? Did she even raise her voice? Thorne stared at the frozen image on the screen. His attorney whispered something to him. Her verbal non-compliance was a form of resistance, he said, the words sounding weak even to him. Her verbal non-compliance, Croft repeated with theatrical disbelief. So, a citizen asking a police officer to verify his information is now considered resistance? A school principal exercising his duty to protect his students is obstruction? Is that what they taught you at the academy, Deputy? The county attorney objected. Argumentative? I'll rephrase, Croft said smoothly, never taking his eyes off Thorne. Did Ms. Jenkins ever physically threaten you? No. Did she ever attempt to flee? No. Did she make any movements at all that would suggest she was a threat to you, your partner, or anyone on that playground? Thorne was silent. The silence stretched for 10, then 20 seconds. The only sound was the clicking of the court reporter's machine. "Let the record show the witness is not responding," Croft said calmly. "No." Thorne finally mumbled, his gaze fixed on the table. Croft then moved to the booking room. "At the station, Sergeant Davis informed you that you had arrested the wrong person. He pointed out the 9-year age discrepancy. Is that correct?" "Yes. And it was at that moment, after you knew with 100% certainty that Miss Jenkins was not the felon you were looking for, that you decided to charge her with obstruction and resisting arrest. Is that correct?" Yes. Why?" Croft's question was a surgeon's scalpel, sharp and precise. "Why charge a woman you know is innocent of the crime you arrested her for with new, lesser crimes?" Thorne's face was slick with sweat. He looked to his lawyers for help, but they could offer none. He was trapped by his own actions, cornered by the truth. "She had obstructed my investigation from the beginning," he repeated, clinging to the lie like a life raft. "Your investigation into what, deputy?" Croft thundered, his voice filling the room. "Your investigation was over. You had the wrong woman. The only thing you were investigating at that point was how to cover your own tracks. Isn't that right? You weren't charging a crime. You were creating an alibi for your own incompetence." "Objection," the county attorney shouted. But the damage was done. Over 6 grueling hours, Julian Croft had systematically dismantled Mark Thorne's credibility, using the officer's own words and the irrefutable video evidence against him. He had exposed the initial arrest not as a simple mistake, but as a product of reckless, ego-driven policing, and more importantly, he had revealed the subsequent charges for what they were: a malicious, calculated attempt to punish an innocent woman for the crime of being wrongfully arrested. Thorne's arrogance, so formidable on the playground, had completely dissolved under the pressure of a sworn oath, leaving only the pathetic, sweat-soaked truth behind. A week after the deposition, Julian Croft called Sarah to his office. The transcript of Thorne's testimony was on the table, a thick, bound volume of hubris and prevarication. "They're scared," Croft said, a grimly satisfied look on his face. "Thorne was a catastrophe for them. He came across as arrogant, incompetent, and worst of all, a liar. The county council called me this morning. They want to talk settlement." Sarah felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. For months, the lawsuit had been an abstract thing, a series of papers and legal maneuvers. Now, it was becoming real. "What does that mean?" "It means they know they're going to lose if this goes to a jury," Croft explained. "Imagine 12 ordinary citizens watching that body cam footage and then listening to Thorne try to justify his actions. The county's risk management department has run the numbers, and they've decided it's time to try and stop the bleeding." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "They made an initial offer. I'm obligated to present it to you, but I also want you to know that it is, in my professional opinion, an insult." Sarah looked down at the number, $75,000. She stared at it, the number swimming before her eyes. $75,000. It was a lot of money, more than her annual salary. But measured against what she had been through, it felt like nothing. It felt like a nuisance fee. The cost of making a problem go away. "What does this include?" she asked quietly. "It includes a check," Croft said, his voice laced with disdain. "And a non-disclosure agreement so airtight you wouldn't be able to tell your own sister what happened. It includes no admission of wrongdoing. It includes no termination for Deputy Thorne. It includes no changes to their policies or training. It is, in short, hush money. They want to pay you to pretend this never happened." Sarah thought back to the past 6 months. The sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks that would come out of nowhere. The way some parents still looked at her with a flicker of suspicion in their eyes. The therapy sessions she had started to deal with the trauma. She thought of her students, some of whom still asked her about the bad policeman and needed reassurance that he wouldn't come back. She pushed the piece of paper back across the table. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was filled with an unshakable certainty. "Absolutely not." Croft leaned back in his chair, a broad smile spreading across his face. "That's what I told them you'd say. I told them they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with." "This was never about the money," Sarah said, feeling a surge of strength. "If we take this, what changes? Thorne stays on the street. The department continues to operate the same way. What's to stop him from doing this to someone else? Someone who doesn't have a video? Someone who doesn't have a community supporting them?" "Exactly," Croft agreed. "A settlement without accountability is a victory for them, not for us. So, we're going to send them a counter-demand, and it's not going to be just about the money. We will demand a public apology. We will demand the termination of Mark Thorne. And we will demand a mandatory, top-to-bottom review and overhaul of their training protocols for warrant execution and de-escalation, to be overseen by an independent monitor." "And the money?" Sarah asked, almost as an afterthought. "The money," Croft said, his eyes gleaming, "will be a number so significant that it will serve as a permanent warning to every police department in this state. A number that says, this is the cost of incompetence. This is the price of a cover-up. They think they can put a price on your dignity. We're about to teach them how wrong their calculation is." The rejection of the offer was a declaration. It was Sarah and Julian Croft drawing a line in the sand. They weren't just seeking compensation for a past wrong. They were fighting to change the future. The county had tried to buy their silence with an insulting pittance, hoping she was just another victim looking for a quick payout. They had failed to realize that her resolve had been forged in the crucible of public humiliation, and it was not for sale at any price. The battle was far from over, but the nature of the victory they were seeking had just become crystal clear. It wasn't about a check. It was about change. While the legal battle played out in depositions and conference rooms, a second front had opened up in the community. The initial wave of online outrage had coalesced into a powerful, organized grassroots movement. It was led not by activists, but by the people who knew Sarah best, her fellow teachers, the parents of her students, and former students she had taught over the years. The first flashpoint was the monthly school board meeting, 2 weeks after the arrest. The agenda was supposed to be about budget allocations and curriculum updates, but before the meeting could even begin, the room was filled to capacity. Parents and teachers, many wearing blue ribbons in solidarity with Sarah, stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, one by one. They approached the microphone during the public comment period. Their voices were emotional, angry, and unwavering. A mother of one of Sarah's current students spoke, her voice thick with tears. "My son came home from school and asked me if police officers arrest good people. What am I supposed to tell him? How do I explain that the place I send him to be safe was violated by the very people who are supposed to protect us?" A retired teacher who had mentored Sarah spoke next. "I have given 40 years of my life to this district. I have never, in all my time, witnessed such a grotesque abuse of power, such a complete disregard for the sanctity of a school and the well-being of our children." Principal Robert Miller, his face grim, gave a detailed blow-by-blow account of the incident, his testimony ending with a direct challenge to the board and the community leaders. "The trauma inflicted upon our students and staff by the reckless actions of the sheriff's department is real and ongoing. We need more than statements. We need action. We need assurances that this will never, ever happen again." The school board meeting became a lead story on the local news. The community's roar was impossible to ignore. The movement grew. They organized peaceful protests outside the county sheriff's department. Their signs reading, "Protect our teachers," and "Accountability for Thorn." They started a letter-writing campaign, flooding the offices of the county commissioners and the sheriff with thousands of emails and letters demanding Thorn's termination. The teachers' union, a normally cautious and bureaucratic organization, threw its full weight behind Sarah. They funded a public relations campaign, running ads in the local paper and on local radio stations that featured testimonials from parents and colleagues about Sarah's character and dedication. They framed the incident not as an isolated event, but as an attack on the teaching profession itself. Sarah, on Julian Croft's advice, did not speak at these rallies or meetings. Her role was to be the quiet, dignified center of the storm while the community raged on her behalf. But she attended every event, standing silently in the crowd, drawing strength from the outpouring of support. It was a profoundly humbling experience. For 20 years, she had poured her heart into her community. Now, that community was pouring its heart back into her, defending her, fighting for her. The pressure began to have a noticeable effect on the county's leadership. The county commissioners, who were initially silent, began to release statements expressing their deep concern. The sheriff, a politician who was used to controlling the narrative, found himself constantly on the defensive. At a tense press conference, he was peppered with questions about Thorn's history and the department's training policies. His evasive, boilerplate answers only fueled the public's anger. This was no longer just Sarah Jenkins's fight. It was Northwood Elementary's fight. It was the town's fight. The parents and teachers had transformed a personal injustice into a collective cause. They had refused to let the story fade away. They understood that the lawsuit was a slow, methodical process. Their role was to keep the moral and public pressure at a boiling point, to ensure that the officials involved could not hide in the quiet corridors of power. They were Sarah's voice in the public square, and their roar was becoming deafening. The county wasn't just facing a lawsuit anymore. They were facing a full-blown community rebellion. For months, the county had successfully stonewalled the release of the official body camera footage, citing the ongoing internal investigation and the civil litigation. Their lawyers filed motion after motion to keep it under seal. But Julian Croft was relentless. He argued that the public had a right to see the complete, unedited record of the incident, especially since the department's public statements were so at odds with the cell phone videos already in circulation. Finally, after a heated court battle, a judge agreed. He ordered the immediate release of the footage from both Deputy Thorne's and Deputy Peterson's cameras. It was a monumental victory for Sarah's legal team. The footage was uploaded to the county's public information portal late on a Friday afternoon. A classic tactic to try and bury a bad news story over the weekend. It didn't work. Within minutes, the files were downloaded and disseminated by news outlets and online activists. If the cell phone videos had been damning, the body cam footage was a legal execution. Thorne's camera provided a sickening first-person perspective of his aggression. The audio was crystal clear. It captured his dismissive tone with Principal Miller. It captured Sarah's calm, non-threatening voice asking him to please check his information. It captured the exact moment he lied to Sergeant Davis in the booking room, his voice shifting from arrogant to panicked as he fabricated the obstruction charge. Viewers could hear the change, the conscious decision to commit to a lie. But it was Deputy Peterson's footage that proved to be the most devastating. As the silent partner, his camera became an objective, third-party observer. It showed Thorne shoving the principal. It showed Thorne's unnecessary physical roughness as he handcuffed Sarah. Most importantly, it captured a conversation between the two deputies on the ride back to the station, A conversation they had clearly forgotten was being recorded. "You sure about this one, Mark?" Peterson's voice is heard saying, low and uncertain. The principal seemed pretty convinced we had it wrong. "He's a principal, not a cop." Thorne's voice snaps back. "He doesn't know anything. The warrant is good. The name matches. It's her." "I don't know, man," Peterson says. "This feels messy. Doing it in front of all those kids." "It's called making a public arrest, Pete," Thorne lectures. "Sometimes you gotta send a message that nobody is above the law." The exchange was the smoking gun. It proved Thorne had consciously dismissed his own partner's doubts. It revealed his motive wasn't public safety, but a desire to send a message, a clear indication of a punitive mindset. It demonstrated a level of recklessness that bordered on malice. The release of the footage created a new firestorm, one that dwarfed the initial outrage. The national media, which had moved on to other stories, now circled back with renewed interest. Legal analysts appeared on cable news, dissecting the footage frame by frame, highlighting every procedural violation, every lie, every moment of unchecked aggression. The sheriff's claim that Thorne had acted by the book was now a national joke. For Sarah, watching the footage was a strange, out-of-body experience. It was like watching the worst day of her life directed by a detached observer. But it was also profoundly validating. The footage was the unimpeachable witness. It could not be accused of bias. It could not be intimidated. It simply showed the truth, raw and unvarnished. The body cameras, a tool intended to protect officers from false accusations, had become the primary weapon in the case against one. It stripped away all ambiguity, leaving only the stark reality of what had happened on that playground. The county's lawyers could no longer argue about differing perspectives or the fallibility of memory. The truth was there, recorded in high definition, for the entire world to see. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The footage wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was the entire case. The weekend after the body camera footage was released was the longest of the county attorney's career. His phone rang incessantly. The county commissioners, who had been hiding behind legal procedure, were now in a full-blown panic. The sheriff, who had publicly defended Thorne, was now completely silent, his political future in tatters. The public relations disaster was absolute. The legal case was, for all intents and purposes, over. On Monday morning, Julian Croft received the call he had been expecting. It was the lead counsel for the county. The tone was no longer combative or dismissive. It was the sound of utter defeat. "Julian," the attorney said, dispensing with the usual formalities. "We need to talk. We're prepared to mediate, seriously this time." "I'm listening," Croft said, his voice neutral. He motioned for Sarah, who was in his office for a strategy meeting, to listen in on the speakerphone. "Look," the attorney continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "The footage. It is what it is. We're not going to trial. You know it. I know it. Let's find a number and put this to bed." "It's not just about a number, and you know that," Croft replied coolly. "We sent you our demands weeks ago. They included non-monetary terms. Those terms are not negotiable." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling. The attorney was beaten, and he knew it. "Thorne's termination. That's a personnel matter. It has to go through a process." "Then start the process," Croft said flatly. "Consider it a condition of any settlement. He doesn't wear a badge in this county ever again. We also want the independent oversight of your training protocols. No wiggle room." "And the financial component?" the attorney asked, his voice hesitant. "My client has been through a 9-month ordeal that has permanently altered her life," Croft stated, his voice like ice. She was publicly humiliated, falsely arrested, and maliciously prosecuted. Her good name, built over 2 decades of selfless service to your community, was dragged through the mud by your employee. You will find that the price for that is steep. He named a number, a figure significantly higher than their initial demand, a number designed to shock. Another pause, longer this time. That's not a realistic number. Julian, it's my number, Croft said, and it will be the number I write on a board in front of a jury after they've watched your deputy lie under oath in his deposition. Your choice. Mediate with our terms as the starting point, or we'll see you in court. I'm quite confident in how that will play out. He then hung up. Sarah looked at him, her heart pounding. Was that a bluff? Sarah, Croft said, turning to her with a calm smile. I never bluff. The formal mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks later. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a surrender ceremony. They met in the same neutral conference room where Thorne's deposition had taken place. This time, the county's team was somber and subdued. They brought in a risk management expert and an insurance adjuster. The mediator, a retired federal judge, listened as Croft laid out their case. He didn't need to be dramatic. He simply played 10 minutes of the body camera footage, followed by 5 minutes from Thorne's deposition where he lied about what the video clearly showed. Then he presented the pile of letters from the community, the news clippings, and the psychological evaluation detailing Sarah's ongoing trauma. When he was finished, the room was silent. The mediator looked at the county's team. I'm going to be frank, he said. I've been doing this for 30 years. This is one of the most indefensible cases I have ever seen. If you let this go to a jury, the number Mr. Croft is asking for might end up looking like a discount. The county's lawyers didn't even put up a fight. The rest of the day was spent haggling over the final figures and the precise wording of the policy change agreements. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were just trying to staunch the bleeding. By the end of the day, they had a signed agreement. The county had capitulated on every single point. The public humiliation, the viral videos, the community outrage, and the damning evidence had created a perfect storm from which there was no escape. The county hadn't just lost a lawsuit. It had been brought to its knees by a third-grade teacher who refused to be silenced and a community that refused to let her fight alone. The surrender was complete. The news of the settlement broke the next morning and became an instant national headline. The final figure was staggering, $8.5 million. It was one of the largest settlements for a wrongful arrest case of its kind in the state's history. But for Sarah and her supporters, the money was secondary to the other terms of the agreement, which were made public as a condition of the deal. First, the county issued a formal, public apology to Sarah Jenkins. It was read by the chairman of the county commission at a press conference, with Julian Croft standing silently behind him. The statement acknowledged the profound failure of the sheriff's department, admitted the arrest was without legal basis, and decried the subsequent charges as unwarranted and unjustifiable. It was a complete and total vindication. Second, Mark Thorne was terminated, effective immediately. The internal affairs investigation, which had been languishing for months, was suddenly completed. It found him guilty of multiple policy violations, including false arrest, conduct unbecoming of an officer, and dishonesty. His career in law enforcement was over. His name, once a symbol of unchecked authority, was now a cautionary tale whispered in police academies. Third, and perhaps most importantly for the long term, the county agreed to a comprehensive, court-enforced reform of the sheriff's department. The agreement mandated a complete overhaul of their training on warrant service, de-escalation techniques, and confirmation of identity. It required the implementation of a new early warning system to flag officers who, like Thorne, accumulated a pattern of citizen complaints. And it established a civilian oversight board with the power to review and recommend discipline in cases of officer misconduct. The implementation of these changes would be supervised by an independent monitor, chosen jointly by Croft's firm and the county for a period of no less than 3 years. The settlement was not just a check. It was a blueprint for change. It was a public acknowledgement that the system was broken and a binding commitment to fix it. For Sarah, the day the settlement was announced was surreal. Her phone rang off the hook with calls from reporters and well-wishers. Her face was on every news channel, but she avoided the spotlight, spending the day quietly at home with her sister. The money was an abstract concept, a number on a page that she couldn't fully comprehend. It was security, of course. It was a means to an end. But it could never erase the memory of the cold steel on her wrists or the look of terror on her students' faces. It was not a prize. It was a payment for damages inflicted. It was the price the county had to pay for its failure. That evening, the Northwood Elementary Parent-Teacher Association held a small, private gathering in the school library to celebrate. There were no news cameras, just the teachers, parents, and staff who had been there from the beginning. Robert Miller, his eyes glistening with emotion, raised a glass of sparkling cider. "To Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "who taught us all a lesson in courage, dignity, and resilience. She faced down injustice and won. She reminded this whole country that one person, armed with the truth, can indeed change the world." As her friends and colleagues applauded, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her for the first time in nearly a year. The fight was over. The nightmare had ended. She had been through hell, but she had come out the other side not just whole, but stronger. She had lost her anonymity, but she had found her voice. The price of accountability had been high, both for her and for the county. But in the end, justice had been served, not just for her, but for every citizen who believed that a badge should be a symbol of trust, not a license for abuse. In the years that followed, the story of Sarah Jenkins's wrongful arrest became more than just a news event. It became a catalyst. The settlement money, while providing her with financial security, was secondary to the platform it gave her. She could have quietly retired, retreating from the public eye to heal. Instead, she chose to use her experience to forge a lasting legacy, with a significant portion of the settlement. She established the Jenkins Foundation for Accountable Policing. It was a non-profit organization with a clear, focused mission to provide resources, legal support, and advocacy for victims of police misconduct, and to fund innovative training programs for law enforcement agencies committed to reform. Her first act was to partner with a consortium of retired police chiefs, civil rights lawyers, and psychologists to develop a new training curriculum called the Northwood Protocol. It used the body camera footage of her arrest as a central teaching tool. Recruits and veteran officers in departments across the country watched the incident unfold, breaking it down moment by moment. They analyzed Thorne's tactical errors, his failure to de-escalate, his target fixation, and the catastrophic consequences of his pride. They discussed what he should have done differently at every critical juncture. The goal wasn't to shame officers, but to provide a visceral, real-world example of how quickly a situation can spiral out of control when procedure and professionalism are abandoned in favor of ego and intimidation. The Jenkins Foundation also became a powerful voice for legislative change. Sarah, no longer just a teacher but a respected national advocate, testified before state legislatures and congressional committees. She spoke with a quiet authority that was more compelling than any fiery rhetoric. She didn't just talk about statistics or legal theories. She told her story. She described the feeling of the handcuffs, the fear in her students' eyes, and the chilling realization that the person sworn to protect her was, in fact, her greatest threat. Her advocacy was instrumental in the passage of legislation in several states known informally as Sarah's Laws. These laws strengthened civilian oversight of police departments, mandated de-escalation training as a yearly requirement, and made it easier for citizens to access police misconduct records. The county where her arrest took place became an unwilling poster child for reform. Under the watchful eye of the independent monitor, the sheriff's department was slowly and painfully transformed. The old guard who resisted the changes were pushed out, and a new generation of leadership, committed to the principles of community policing and constitutional rights, was brought in. The department's relationship with the community, shattered on that Tuesday morning, began the long, slow process of being rebuilt. Sarah eventually returned to the classroom at Northwood Elementary. It was where she felt most at home, most herself. Her fame was a strange, ever-present reality. New students would sometimes whisper, "That's the Miss Jenkins," but in the day-to-day routine of teaching multiplication tables and reading stories, she was simply their teacher. Yet, something had changed. She carried herself with a new sense of purpose. She had faced down the worst the system could throw at her, and had not only survived, but had forced the system to bend to the will of justice. She had shown her students, in the most powerful way imaginable, that one person's courage could ripple outward, creating waves of change that could reshape the world. Her legacy was not written in the headlines or in the dollar amount of the settlement. It was written in the improved training of a police officer in a different state, in the new law that protected a citizen's rights, and in the quiet confidence of a child who learned from her teacher that you must always stand up for what is right, no matter how powerful the person you have to stand up to. The story of Sarah Jenkins began with a catastrophic failure, not of malice, but of ego. Deputy Thorne's actions likely stemmed from a deeply ingrained insecurity, a need to project an image of absolute control that is often instilled in law enforcement culture. Faced with a situation that didn't neatly fit his expectations, and challenged, however politely, by figures of civilian authority like a principal, his training failed him. Instead of pausing to verify, he chose to escalate, believing that any hesitation would be perceived as weakness. His tragic flaw was not the initial misidentification, but the prideful doubling down, the inability to admit a mistake. He chose to ruin an innocent woman's life rather than face the momentary embarrassment of being wrong. His actions are a stark reminder that the greatest threat to justice is not always hatred, but the quiet, corrosive power of human pride. In retrospect, it's hard to see how Sarah could have protected herself better in that moment, for she did everything right. If she had been more forceful, she would have been labeled aggressive. If she had been silent, it would have been taken as an admission of guilt. Her calm, rational demeanor was her only defense. And in the face of irrational authority, it was not enough. Perhaps the only hypothetical that could have changed that morning's outcome is one that lies with the silent partner. If Deputy Peterson had possessed the courage to voice his doubts more forcefully, to insist on a simple ID check before the cuffs came out, the entire tragedy could have been averted. His silence was his complicity. It teaches us that, in the presence of injustice, neutrality is an illusion. It is a choice that sides with the oppressor. The ultimate message of this story is one of profound hope and resilience. It affirms that while systems can fail and individuals can abuse their power, the collective power of a community, armed with truth and unified in purpose, can be an unstoppable force for accountability. Sarah's story is a testament to the fact that integrity is not a passive quality but an active choice, made moment by moment. It reminds us that the fight for justice is often a marathon, not a sprint. One not in a single, dramatic confrontation, but in the meticulous gathering of facts, the unwavering support of allies, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept what is wrong. What part of Sarah's journey resonated with you the most? Her composure during the arrest, her decision to fight back, or her work in building a legacy afterward? Have you ever witnessed a situation where you felt someone in authority was making a terrible mistake? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our work to continue telling these important stories.